Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Um, our final speaker will be Neill Franklin. He's an executive director of LEAP, which stands for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And their mission is to speak out about the failures of our existing drug policies. Over his 33-year law enforcement career, Neill watched hardworking and dedicated fellow cops die in the line of fire enforcing policies that don't do any good. After 23 years with the Maryland State Police, including as an undercover narc and as the head trainer for drug enforcement, Neill was recruited by the Baltimore Police Department to recognize its education and training division. In 2010, he began his work with LEAP. So can we all welcome Neill Franklin?
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, let me be sure to attach my tether here because I have a problem with roaming, so I will stay exactly where I am as ordered to do so. I'm very good with following orders. I guess that's part of being a police officer. You become accustomed to that. So thank you for having me here today. This is such an important event. This work is so important, but it cannot be accomplished. This mission cannot be accomplished by just a few people, and that's why this is a movement. It has to be a movement, and in order for it to be a successful movement, this is really about education. I think it was said earlier about when we would come to these events and look out into the audience, I would ask, where are my black brothers and sisters? I started speaking out publicly with the organization Law Enforcement Against Prohibition in 2008, even though I had begun to travel down this road since the early 2000s. And as I would go to these events to speak, I would ask that question, where are my black brothers and sisters? This is an issue where the black community is most devastated by this problem of the war on drugs. At the same time, when I would look behind me, there weren't many black brothers and sisters lining up to speak about it either. Just a few, and as Cassandra said, who would sometimes end up being persecuted for speaking about this issue. Organizations like the NAACP, how long it took to get them to pay some attention to this issue of mass incarceration. Now, they're moving a little bit on the war on drugs. You know, they've passed a resolution to end the war on drugs, but they haven't really defined what that means yet. But we're working on that. Just a quick description of LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, the organization that I speak for. It's an organization that's been around since 2002. It's an international organization of law enforcement professionals. I'm talking police officers, prosecutors, judges, federal agents, corrections officials, anyone in the criminal justice system, law enforcement who has something to do with first contact at the police level in making an arrest, all the way through the criminal justice system to parole and probation. We've been on the front lines of the war on drugs for a very long time. And so we speak to the abject failure of these policies from many different perspectives. Now, you may, as we travel around and speak, you know, there are still people, even though we come from this place of being on the front lines of the war on drugs, we still have people who tell us we don't know what we're talking about. You know, they don't believe what we're telling them. And I say, you know, you may disagree with us, but you can't tell us we don't know what we're talking about. We know why this work is being done. Let me begin here with a quote. And after the quote, I'll tell you who wrote this quote, or who spoke this. It says, stringent laws, vigorous prosecution, and imprisonment of addicts and peddlers have proved not only useless and enormously expensive as means of correcting this evil, but they are also unjustifiably and unbelievably cruel in their application to the unfortunate drug victims. Repression has driven this vice underground and produced the narcotic smugglers and supply agents who have grown wealthy out of this evil practice and who, by devious methods, have stimulated traffic in drugs. Finally, and not the least of these evils associated with repression, the helpless addict has been forced to resort to crime in order to get the money for the drug, which is absolutely indispensable for his comfortable existence. That's a quote from someone back in the 1930s by the name of August Vollmer. Does that name sound familiar to any of you? Probably not, maybe one or two. But believe it or not, that quote came from a police officer. And not just any police officer, but a police officer who back in the 1930s became one of the leaders, the presidents of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which unfortunately today is one of the agencies, the organizations out there that is most resistant to this type of change at the moment. But we're working on that. So here's a police officer who back in the 1930s saw the road that we were beginning to travel down. After the passing of the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act, after dealing with alcohol prohibition and the problems that came from that, the crime, the violence, the corruption, and the list is long. He was now predicting what was going to happen if we traveled down the same road with prohibiting these drugs, but we failed to listen. So what are some of the things that happened because we failed to listen? And so let me run through the numbers real quick. Some numbers mainly in the area of disparity, but let me begin here. From 1980 to 2000, the number of people incarcerated in the United States quadrupled. From roughly 500,000, 500,000, to now 2.3 million people. Here we are in this country, 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. In the land of the free, home of the brave. The land of the free, freedoms, the Constitution. This is what we're dealing with. We incarcerate more people, not just in rate, but in hard numbers than any other country around the globe. And we attack other countries for their lack of humanity. Let me continue. Here are some racial disparity problems that have come from this failure of us to listen. And as said before, the real reason we traveled down this road was about social control and economics. At the end of the day, economics is in there somewhere in this wonderful world of capitalism. So African Americans now constitute 1 million of that 2.3 million in prison. But yet we're, about 12, 13% of the population in this country? Yeah, there's something wrong there. African Americans are incarcerated at nearly 6 times the rate of whites. Together, African Americans and our Hispanic brothers and sisters comprised 58% of all prisoners in 2008. And even though African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately 1/4 of the U.S. population, according to Unlocking America, if African American and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rates of whites today, today's prison and jail populations would decline by approximately 50%. There's a campaign that's alive and well today. It's called Cut 50. Have you heard of that? Cut 50. Well, if we were to just do that, then we'd do what that campaign wants to do. Again, this all sits squarely upon the war on drugs. 1 in 3 black males born today and I believe many of you have probably heard this, can expect to spend some time in prison during their lifetime. 1 in 100 African American women are now in prison. Again, thank the war on drugs for an 800% increase in that area. Nationwide, African Americans represent 26% of juvenile arrests. So see, we got to talk about our kids. We really got to talk about our kids and what's happening to our kids. In the school-to-prison pipeline, and I was talking to someone the other day when I was doing a presentation at Towson State University, and I'm so glad that we're here at Morgan talking about this issue. We should be at Morgan, we should be at Spelman, we should be at Morehouse, we should be at Howard, Hampton, all of our historical black universities and colleges. We should be there. And not just talking about it on those campuses, but those campuses should be moving this issue. I'll come back to that. But when I was talking the other day at Towson about this issue of our young people in the school-to-prison pipeline, and I was telling them, describing to see some of these kids at Towson have never seen our schools in the inner city. So I was describing what those schools physically look like compared to schools in Baltimore County, Howard County, Harford County, how deplorable they are, and the cages on the outside, the windows, and the metal detectors when you walk through the door, and the feeling that you get when you walk into the... I'm an adult. I've got 34 years in law enforcement, and when I walk into one of those schools, I think I'm at the Baltimore City Detention Center. That's the feeling I get. And it's not just the physical feeling, but that's also how these kids are treated when they're in school. And you can look at the suspension rates and expulsion rates to figure that out. Nationwide, African Americans represent 26% of juvenile arrests, 44% of youth who are detained, 46% of youth who are judicially waived to criminal court, from juvenile court to criminal court, and 58% of the youth admitted to state prisons are African American youth. Drug sentencing disparities: about 14 million whites and 2.6 million African Americans report using an illicit drug. And I think you heard some of those numbers earlier. 5 times as many whites are using drugs as African Americans, yet African Americans are sent to prison for drug offenses, like drug offenses, at 10 times the rate of whites. And I'm going to tell you something, folks, as someone who, again, has been on the side of criminal justice in my 3 decades of policing, where I worked undercover, where I commanded drug task forces, 7 at one time in the western part of Maryland, and then 9 when I had the entire Eastern Shore in Harford and Cecil counties. The system, unfortunately, folks, is set up that we target our black and brown communities, mainly our black communities. And there are a number of reasons for that, a couple of which. Number one, there is no political strength and power within many of our impoverished black communities. There just isn't. The votes aren't there. Economically, there is no power, there is no strength. The money is just not there. And the way we in law enforcement went about measuring success, the more arrests we made, we must be doing a really good job. When we should be measuring crime by the lack of arrests that we made. But a lot had to do with how we measured success. You see, when we have federal dollars that are made available to law enforcement to enforce these drug policies, and some of the criteria for applying for those grants is about how many drug arrests are you making. The more arrests we make, the more chances we have of getting that money. Incentivize policing. And it's not just about the federal grants and the civil asset forfeiture dollars that we get in enforcing these laws, but for the individual officer, because that's how we rate you, that's how we evaluate you, you're going to get a better assignment if you make more arrests. You're going to get a promotion if you make more arrests. And the easiest arrests to make are drug-related. And as Seema was saying earlier today, for marijuana, because of that odor thing going on. Makes it very easy. There's so many more numbers, and I just wanted to run down some statistics for you because I believe now that we have access to this data, I think that we are beginning to make some headway as it relates to rolling back some of these policies that are contributing to mass incarceration in this country and the disparity issues that follow that. So as I begin to wrap up, I want to cover some things that I think are very important about where we are and where we will be going from here. I want to cover something just real quick about, when I say Baltimore, I'm also talking about any other major city across this country. And I just want to talk briefly about the history in Baltimore, going back into the late 60s. I grew up in Baltimore. I grew up in Reservoir Hill, which is a community that's trying to recover from a lot of damage of years past. And when I grew up in Baltimore City, the row homes, this is a city of row homes, and just about, I don't remember any vacant row houses. They all were occupied. We had about 1 million people in this city. And many of these homes were occupied by black folk, still are. And my father was a longshoreman, so he worked down on the docks. Industry was booming. We had Bethlehem Steel. We had General Motors. We had Western Electric. And if you were black, you could get a decent paying job and have only a 6th grade education, like my dad. But then something happened. In corporate America, we started sending jobs overseas. Bethlehem Steel literally collapsed. The shipbuilding industry began to suffer and disappear, and other industries started to leave as well. Remember, I'm talking about other major cities across this country, too. And people were finding themselves out of work, mainly black folk were finding themselves out of work, and especially with less than high school educations, it wasn't a very good chance that you were going to find employment elsewhere with another company somewhere. But you know what? The bills still have to be paid. The rent has to be paid. The mortgages have to be paid. Food has to be placed on the tables. And you do what you got to do. So I think about my neighborhood, in just about every household, the mother was home. Why? Because the father could make enough money to support the family. And there were 5 of us siblings in that house. My father found what we call a hustle. He became a bookie for the illegal numbers racket. He worked for little Willie Adams. And I would even go with him on Sundays as he would make his rounds, paying and collecting book. I didn't know what he was doing, but he was doing what he had to do to make ends meet. There were other fathers who did something else. They started selling drugs. You see, because everybody couldn't book numbers, but you could go sell drugs. Again, you had to bring the money in the house. But then, in the 1970s, we started what? Richard Milhouse Nixon, the war on drugs, public enemy number 1. And doing that, he recruited local law enforcement like the Baltimore Police Department into this effort of combating drugs. But you can't have a war on drugs, folks. It's like having a war on this microphone. Okay, it just is. Whether it's going to be a good microphone or a bad microphone, it depends upon the environment in which we use it. You have a war on people. And we went into cities, law enforcement, with federal dollars to start dismantling drug organizations. So cities like Baltimore, where you had 6 or 7 major drug organizations, we went in and we did just that, started arresting any and everybody that had anything to do with those organizations. And in that process, we took those 6 or 7 organizations who went about their business having regular meetings, deciding how they're going to divide up this industry in the city, which they did. And we didn't have the street shootings. Yeah, we had people dying, But you never heard about it because they were in the business, they knew what they were doing, and if they didn't do what they were supposed to do, something happened to them. They just disappeared one day. Still, again, that's the nature of an illicit business, unfortunately. But we did not have street open-air drug markets where guns became tools of the trade on every corner, being used to capitalize on that market share, crews fighting with each other. We didn't have that back then. But when we dismantled those 6 or 7 organizations, we ended up with 60, then 600 corner organizations where our young sons of those fathers who were being arrested and sent to prison now went out to the street corners because they felt the need to be the men of the household and go out and earn money. See, my father told me I wouldn't do the things that he did. Do as I say, not as I do. And believe me, I listened. And I stayed in school. But it wasn't the same. See, we didn't go after the numbers racket. We just made that legal. The lotto, July 29th, 1976. First number was 408. We just legalized that industry. We need to do the same thing with the war on drugs today. Now, we have a big problem with addiction to gambling, don't we? But the lotto, state by state by state, continues to grow. We have a new game coming out every week. But we still have a problem with addiction. We deal with that how we have to deal with that as a health issue. We need to do the same thing with the war on drugs, end the criminalization and move it to a place of legality and deal with it with our healthcare practitioners and put our police on the back burner. I just needed to cover that real quick because that was the beginning to much of the violent crime that we see here in our cities today. And as we talk about the police and how the police interact with our citizens, and they say, well, wait a minute, you need to be talking about black on black crime. Yes, we do have a problem with black on black crime, but again, it is the policy that has led us to that place. It is the criminalization, the decade after decade of criminalization of the black male that has led us to that place, to where the mothers had to leave the households to go get work, 2, 3 jobs, and our children were left to the streets and the business of selling drugs. So what would happen if we ended drug prohibition? See, this is this fear-mongering that's out there. So let me wrap up with this. Here's what would happen. Violent crime would go down dramatically, beginning with our black on black crime, again, which the foundation is the war on drugs, folks. The gangs and the crews and even the cartels in Central America, where we're losing thousands of people there every year. Organizations cannot exist if they don't have funding. Take the money out of it and see what happens to violent crime and the shootings in all of our cities around this country. They will decline dramatically, just like when we ended alcohol prohibition in 1933. Crime in general, those who are addicted to drugs and what they have to do to pay for these inflated prices that are out there, that would go down as well. The burglaries, the car thefts, the stick-ups, and so on. Addiction would also follow the same suit. You see, because as August Vollmer said, when you make this industry illegal, you end up with people selling drugs on just about every corner. They don't ask for a driver's license. All they want to see is money. And it is my job to get you addicted and to get your friends addicted and to hire young people to get them addicted and have them sell to their young peers in their schools to get them addicted. Addiction goes up in an illicit market. We will always have that challenge, but it becomes worse with the policies that we have adopted. Overdose deaths will begin to decline dramatically as well. In Portugal, where they have decriminalized, 13 years ago, decriminalized all drugs for personal use, they've experienced a 52% reduction in overdose deaths. Corruption, let me tell you, there's nothing corrupting our police departments and officials and politicians more than drugs. Civil asset forfeiture. Oh my God. That's the real highway robbery, folks, where we stop people, find cash, take it, and make them prove that it's not illegal money. And we could do a whole talk on that alone. Constitutional and human rights. We are stopping and searching our young black males right in the middle of the street. If you haven't seen that in Baltimore, you just haven't been out and about in Baltimore. And the marijuana part of that, the smell, the odor, that's the linchpin. When we finally get around to really ending the prohibition of marijuana in this country, let me tell you, the number of searches and illegal searches will decline dramatically. And that's one of the reasons why law enforcement is so resistant to these policy changes with marijuana. You see, because I don't even have to smell it. All I have to do is say I smell it. Search you, find nothing, you complain. What can you complain about? Hey, I did. I smelled marijuana. There's no recourse. There's nothing. There's no accountability. I can search any and anybody, and there's nothing that you can do about it. All I have to do is say I smell marijuana. Police focus. In the 1960s, we solved 9 out of 10 murders in this country. Today, that number is 6 out of 10, and in Baltimore, it's 3 out of 10. Police and community relationships, again, this is what we do. We stop you, whether you're walking, in your car, we search you, we disrespect you, and the list is long. And again, the foundation of it is our war on drugs. Things would change dramatically if we did not have these policies. Mass incarceration, I think we've heard the numbers on that. And access to drugs by our kids. Again, if you wanted to devise a system, a scenario, put together a scenario where kids would have the most access to drugs, we've done it. We've done it by making it illegal, putting so much money in it, to make so much money in such a small amount of time with little effort. Believe me, kids are going to be part of that industry. And the people pushing drugs on our street corners, that's what they do. They recruit our kids. Of all these, and there's more, and of all these things that would improve and conditions that would improve if we were to end the war on drugs, there's one huge problem. And that is the transfer of wealth. You see, because Walmart is not the #1 single employer in the hood. It's the drug trade. A lot of bills are paid, a lot of food is bought with proceeds from the drug trade. And what scares me is what I'm seeing in Colorado, what I'm seeing in Washington State, what I'm seeing in Oregon, and what we're going to see in other states as they legalize cannabis. It's not a new industry, it's the transfer of an industry. Okay? From the hood to the boardrooms. And those people who are making money off of it illegally now are not being they're not becoming part of and won't become part of the legal market, which means whether it's illegal cash or not, it's going to leave the black community in these poor neighborhoods and it's going to go somewhere else. And the laws that are being written as we move marijuana from a place of illegality to legality, the laws that are being written to do that are locking out people who have criminal records. Not only can you not own a license, be a business owner, you can't even work at one of these facilities. Folks, you got to pay attention to what's going on. That's not freedom, folks. So, here's my close. Why is it so difficult when it's so obvious to make such a change? Education is one. We have to continue that, obviously. But unfortunately, the one group of folks who continues to push back at the reforms that we try to make are my brothers and sisters in blue. The police, the prosecutors. If they were to come out today in large numbers and say, we are done with it, we don't want to be a part of this anymore, bring out the doctors and the nurses and the clinicians, let them deal with it, get us out of it. If they were to do that tomorrow, next week, it would be over. It would be done. But why is that not happening? Here it is. 4 decades. It's what we do. And what you do eventually becomes who you are. It's who we are. We don't know anything else. It's 70% of what we do in cities like Baltimore. It's what we're thinking about when we get up in the morning and strap on that uniform. That's what we're thinking about, enforcing drug laws. You're going to tell me that for the past 2 decades of my life and dedication to law enforcement and going out here enforcing these laws, that everything I was doing means nothing? It's not working? As a matter of fact, wait a minute, you're going to tell me that I was actually harming my community? Hell no, I'm not going to believe that. I refuse to believe that. You see, I went through that. And it takes deprogramming, a lot of work. And that's what we need to do. So let's change the message, change the narrative. Let's give our police officers something else to think about and something else to do, like focusing on violent crime. We have to consider what we are giving our cops to do, the laws that we are giving them to enforce. Cops should not be in our schools like in Springfield, removing young women from classrooms who just don't want to get up and leave. And cops should not be enforcing drug laws. If only we treated people who were suffering from addiction of heroin and cocaine the same way we treat people suffering from the addiction of alcohol, which is a much more problematic and deadly drug than many of the ones that we now consider illegal. Let's give the police something else to do and get them out of the business of drugs and turn that over to our doctors, nurses, clinicians, and I think we'll be in a much better place. Thank you, folks.